Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm really excited to be sharing with colleagues at Code a unique social reading pedagogy, which I developed at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg for teaching English literature, which I developed first as residential classroom pedagogy, then as emergency remote teaching, and now is kind of installed as blended learning. Answering the conference is aimed to showcase people-focused practices. Just checking. I am having trouble getting on to the next. All right, that's how I do it. So I wanted to answer the conference's aim to showcase people's focused practices and innovations with an eye to sustainability. My initial intention was to talk about social reading pedagogy and online web annotation, aiming for myself, really, somewhat selfishly, to try to find and forge connections with web-based annotation pedagogy communities in Code's network. I found it difficult to locate these outside of the US, and perhaps there'll be some time and questions to talk about that. But the theme of the conference, Empowering and Sustaining Change, has given me a prompt to reflect, I think, a little more substantively and deeply on something that has troubled me, even while I can see and I'm fully persuaded of the value of the approach I'm describing for sustainable pedagogy. So while the conference theme, while the theme Empowering and Sustaining Change and its sub-themes, that's empowerment, access, inclusion, as well as internationalization and international partnerships, are all very important to my paper, they really come together for me in a word that isn't used in the call for papers, which is transformation. And I think given my context, it might be helpful for me to just sketch in some way what transformation means in a South African context, both for education and more broadly. So in post-apartheid South Africa, oh, that's not the slide I wanted. I'm so sorry. I have not got the slide I want. It's fine. I'll walk you through this nonetheless. In post-apartheid South Africa, the broader goal of education has been and continues to be supporting a project of national transformation. So education, the job market, the economy are all bound up in this. And this is a project that, after 3 decades of democracy, is still incomplete. The critical need for educational transformation and educational access was given visibility by the Fees Must Fall protests in 2015 and 2016, although these are still, in a sense, an important sense, ongoing. In my abstract, I cited Ntombana, Gwala, and Sibanda's paper, and that's from 2023, talking about how this need for educational transformation, educational access is still critical. And there are protests at the start of every teaching year. This year was no different. But the crisis in education in South Africa has just, I think, been buried by a series of other crises. And depressingly, I think what probably most prepared South African universities for the disruption of COVID was Fees Must Fall. And in the wake of those protests, which saw blockading of roads, burning of libraries, and fatalities, universities, mine in particular, that's the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, invested enormously in 2 things. And those were very, very costly biometrics and securitization of campus. And I should say the securitization of campus was already significant. And I'm sorry that I can't show you the image that I wanted to of that securitized campus. And the other was online and blended learning. I think probably the most powerful moment in the protest was when students peacefully occupied the university campus. And in a post-apartheid South African context, it was extremely disturbing and triggering for students to see armored vehicles, they're called nyalas, which had been used to wage war on Black South Africans during the apartheid state of emergency, brought onto university campus in what has been described as a de facto state of emergency, although one was never formally declared. Interestingly, there was a meeting of the kind of security apparatus, and it did not include the Minister of Education, because this was a security concern for the country. Securitization addressed the risk of occupation and ensured protection of university, that is state property, during the protests. As I said, the university library was set on fire at some point. There was a huge destruction to property, and that's a kind of a complicated question. So I won't get into the details of who did that. But it was the university's investment in remote teaching that ensured protection of the academic program, which is essential to its economy and, of course, to the national economy in South Africa. So when we think about access, and again, I'm sorry I don't have the image to help you with this, I wanted you to picture the computer labs that I was showing you, but also the turnstile gates at my campus, and recognize that both of these are working to protect certain interests against demands for transformation. Under the banner of fees must fall, students were protesting exclusion and the lack of financial access, and they shut down the campus to make other students aware of their exclusion. So that is to make affluent students who can afford fees, etc., aware that some students cannot. Giving students access to learning, bypassing the disruption created by the protests was, and still is in this context, also a way to perpetuate exclusion. And ironically, here this connects with Professor Stiasny's keynote on TNE, the attempt to transform education to make it more equitable, which was fees must fall, pushed many more privileged students towards TNE options, which ultimately has the effect of undermining national education and deepening the educational divide. And you can see how educators are put in a very difficult position by this. So while campus access is challenging for many students and remote learning can help students, access to the internet and online learning is rendered problematic not just by unequal distribution of wealth, but by the country's ongoing power crisis, which has been affecting me this morning, which at times has seen the country, the power grid delivering power to South Africans only 50% of the time. And that's a kind of a distributed arbitrary 50% across the day. And that's just the national grid, so it doesn't include the days and weeks-long failures due to failing electrical infrastructure, which is an ongoing challenge. So what I really want to outline there is, it's complicated. Access is intimately tied up in this context with exclusion as well as inclusion. And while we talk about disruption in the context of educational technology and innovation and opportunities that come out of disruption, we also cannot, I think, ignore the disruption that is not permitted and whose goal is in fact transformation. So I just wanted to put some of those kind of keywords up there and slightly complicate how we think about those using the specificity of the South African example. It's certainly true that emergency remote teaching afforded me an opportunity to address problems that I'd experienced in my teaching that are, on the one hand, global. I've written about this in the context of the development of literary studies and literature departments, methods of close reading, how we assess, and how we end up fundamentally with the problem of students that we train to write and think like chatbots. In a context where we now have chatbots and can hopefully see that those are not useful skills. At the same time, there are also problems that are locally linked to historical inequality and the way that teaching works on South African campuses. So in 2018 to 2020, I developed and introduced a pedagogy moving from what I call expecting notes to noting expectations. Using just-in-time teaching to integrate reading into teaching. So the idea here is really that we, how can I put this? Trying to refocus attention away from essays, which allow students to bypass learning and to create a kind of an assessment, integrated assessment and learning protocol that cannot be bypassed. And I did this in the context particularly of a course, Theatre of Blood, which is actually a course on English theatre, Renaissance revenge dramas, putting a play by Kidd, by Middleton, and by Shakespeare, kind of up for grabs, and inviting students to think about these plays, not in terms of what they mean, which they can receive online, which they can learn, which they can be told, but precisely in terms of how they experience them as an audience. Acknowledging, and this is very important for South Africa, that these students are not the audience for whom these plays were written, although indeed I think no audience now is the audience for whom these plays were written, and that's important. And what it does is to focus their attention on what are your expectations at a particular moment in a play. How is a dramatist working with your expectations, or failing to work with them, possibly because you simply lack the framework that they're expecting from an audience. And the intention here is to get students, instead of knowing the right answer, to focus on process. How are they thinking? How are they perceiving the work? What frameworks of understanding make an anticipation available or not available to them? And then to actually engage the expectations of others so that misunderstanding, failure of comprehension becomes part of the reading and interpretation experience, as do affects like confusion and boredom. These can actually be really useful ways to unpack how the plays work, how they mean. And it's important in this context, there are two things going on that I would describe as leveling the playing field. One has to do with this course itself, which is essentially putting Shakespeare alongside two other dramatists. And the thing that I like about teaching this course is that by the end of it, students are usually convinced that the other two playwrights are probably better than Shakespeare. And I feel that if I've done that, then I have achieved what I'm looking for. And doing that precisely by taking attention away from this kind of top-down colonial idea of literary value and instead treating these as living machines designed to create entertainment. And it should also be leveling the playing field for students within those classes. So what shifted with online teaching was I was able to do a version of this, but it was very, very limited by students' expectations of essays and assessment. And when everything went online for remote emergency teaching during COVID, that opened up space to essentially move the classroom to the text itself. So rather than having students be able to just show up for a class and their having been there makes them feel that they've done something, the text becomes the class. And the text is made available to them continuously through online web annotation. So what I used here was the Hypothesis Open Web Annotation OWA tool, integrated with our LMS, which is a version of Canvas. This allowed students to note and share their expectations as they read the plays, to see and respond to each other's evolving understandings as they read, and to pose and respond to questions. So here you can hopefully see some idea of what their experience would be like. You can see a text here, it's Middleton's Revenge is Tragedy, which they can access through these buttons, and highlight text, create an annotation, and then others can respond to those annotations. And you have these long nested dialogues happening between students. Taking a community of inquiry framework approach, social annotation activated and centered social and cognitive presence supported by teaching presence, rather than centering teaching presence. Synchronous live classes on Big Blue Button or Zoom were focused on the text, not just in terms of content emphasis, but physically. The main screen showed not the lecturer, but the shared playtext with student annotations, which launched conversations that continued through and after classes. Online text enabled for synchronous and asynchronous online annotation within the LMS made it possible to move the space of learning into the space of reading, the margins of the online page now prioritized as a space of discussion, and to make this continuous reading, here it's reading with a W at the front, this continuous reading work the grounds for assessment. And it's maybe useful, I don't know if this will work, to show you, yeah, this kind of lets you see what it's like for a user navigating this tool. Hypothesis, so I'm very curious about the tools that are being used for social annotation in in a UK context. The reason that I really have favored Hypothesis and I'm quite excited by it has a lot to do with its lightness and sustainability, its kind of global reach beyond pedagogy, beyond education, and really just the kind of technical fact that the way that this works is it's a skin. So effectively, if you have, it's not something like Perusal where you go to a site or you have kind of texts which are hosted within that site, licenses and such. You can have an add-on for your web browser that would allow you to go to any text that is stored anywhere online and annotate that, either publicly, so that any annotator in the world who also has that can see your annotations and interact, or in this case, creating a classroom, a group, so that annotations are just available visually to people in that group.
5 minutes.
Sorry?
5 minutes.
Sorry, the sound.
5 minutes left, Colette.
Oh, thank you so much. So there are two things that I wanted to really pull out of this. I would love to talk about all the positives, but I actually felt that it was important to think about the negatives, and that's what this gave me an opportunity to do, is really dig a bit deeper. So the approach that I've sketched here, which is taking students from expectation noting to noting expectations, was developed. Well, it shows signs of being effective and scalable across disciplines, enhancing student access and engagement in the university, and very importantly, democratizing learning. So that scalability and that access and democratizing. And it was on this basis that it was awarded my university's Group Teaching Award in 2024. And my former PhD student, Carrie Timlin, who collaborated with me as a writing fellow, is here presenting in the same session. But in the same year, that's last year, 2024, that we received the award, there was something that troubled me, because 2024 was probably the easiest year for teaching this course. In its first year, 2021, there was enormous anxiety and pushback and complications around social media affordances, and a course where I really had to claw back goodwill in quite a radical way. There was still that come to Jesus moment, but it took a lot. In 2022, we tried a very counterintuitive experiment of staying out of the annotations, which really goes against kind of Harrington's model of authentic learning, best practice of modeling with students, and a dream that I had about how democratic this open space could be. And that was actually a game changer. That really made the course very successful. In 2023, we did the same thing, but we lost access to the paid version with LMS integration. And we delivered the same course, only with a little bit more friction, but actually with some affordances from using the free version, because that allowed students to get email updates, which when someone posted on their annotations, which otherwise wasn't available for reasons to do with protection of information. In 2024, this course ran smoothly with no real changes from 2023. It was pleasant, it was lovely, it was an absolute delight, very easy, ticked all the boxes for access, inclusion, social support, multimodal literacies. But this pedagogy, which previously had the effect of leveling the class significantly, of shifting students' perceptions of their peers, and really signaling allowing weaker students to gain recognition and to excel, appeared to have a less transformative aspect for this cohort. So in 2024, it challenged high-performing students as it had in previous years. But what we found is that typically by the end of the course, there was more equal participation, and the lower performing students were performing much better. So it challenged the higher performing students. They raised their game, but the whole class was really elevated by this. In 2024, we had a much less pronounced version of this effect. And there probably isn't time to go into the details, but it really showed in work, in performance results in this course and also in other courses. Something that I have thought about is that 2024 was our first cohort to have not experienced emergency remote teaching. And I think it's possible that this affected their willingness to engage in online sessions and also to think differently. That while disruption opens space for things to change, the restoration of in-person teaching may in some ways have restored a status quo and with it a kind of a social complacency. So remote learning kind of opened this critical window for learning where things could be done differently, reopening pathways that may have now partly closed, while EdTech has made enormous advances with more socially conservative applications and outcomes. I hope I still have a minute because there's one more little thing I wanted to get through. Check time.
Yeah, that's fine, Colette.
Brilliant, 2 minutes, ideal. So there's one more nuancing, and again, it's a slight bummer, to do with the implications for inclusion and access in internationalizing and transnational education. So receiving the Teaching Award gave us a mandate, that's myself and Dr. Timlin, to build a network of social annotation educators in the Global South, focusing on sustainability, sharing knowledge, building capacity around what can be an extremely low-cost, lightweight tool that can be used locally and can also allow for international teaching and collaboration that is not top-down. So it enables students to work with students in other countries in these kind of open text annotation classes. This is open pedagogy, also open research, referencing important work in the UK. This is obviously ambitious, and I had expected it to be challenging, but I'd also expected that we'd have a willing partner in the company Hypothesis, where the company really only stands to gain from wider use of their tool, where you have champions for Hypothesis as a free tool for sustainable pedagogy in lower income countries and institutions. And we have been met with disappointment. In 2024, the Hypothesis Social Learning Innovator Awards were made. There was no call for applications, and we noticed that the awardees were all colleges in the US. And this also is reflected in the participation and recognition at Hypothesis's conference, Annotate Ed. We have been reaching out since October last year when we won the award, indicating that we'd like to work towards a panel on annotation from the margins, bringing together users in the Global South for Annotate Ed 2025, and suggesting to do an interview on their podcast program to kind of help to give us some momentum. And we were ignored for 2024 by the contact person dealing with the university who's following up on a paid license. Other attempts to contact the company were met with generic sales support. Researchers working at Hypothesis that we reached out to also ignored email, although I continue to get updates about Hypothesis and the transformative work it's doing and how much it wants to support people. When we finally received an answer, that's in January of this year, we were again put through to someone in sales. Although I'd been very explicit by this point that this is not what we wanted. We were trying to get through to someone in education and outreach, which is very active, but seems closed off to educators outside the US and outside of the network of paid support. A month ago, I had a response from the AE covering new business, apologizing for the delay and explaining our primary focus is on supporting colleges and universities that are using Hypothesis within their LMS systems. I'm promising to get back to us, and it's, yeah, we're now on half a year. And I have to, I think, point out, I've thought very carefully about this because I managed the pilot of Hypothesis in our institution. The cost of Hypothesis, which may seem a low-cost tool for many institutions, is unsupportable practically as well as ethically in my university's context, given the financial pressures on the university and what I know about how usable their open web annotation using their browser add-on is and how it could support sustainable pedagogy. Just in closing, I want to really commend Code on making this conference registration cost-free and open to remote participants. We really wanted to be in London for the opportunity to network at the University of London, but we chose not to travel there so that we would be able to devote more of the award resources to this capacity building project. So really grateful for this. I hope it's opened up some items for discussion. I would really love to connect with educators who are interested or involved in annotation and pedagogy, especially to understand what's happening in the UK. I have some idea of TALIS, of the tools being used there, but I can't really see something like Hypothesis being used. So if there isn't time in the session or during the conference, please get in touch with me by email. And yeah, I really look forward to our conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Colette.